All right, welcome to another episode of Piecing It Together, the podcast where we take a look at a new movie and try to figure out what movies inspired it. And today on the show, we are taking a look at Spiral from the Book of Saw. This is the latest in the Saw franchise, although it's kind of a spin-off. It is a original Chris Rock idea. For Chris Rock, the stand-up comedian and sometimes actor, and lately very much actor, decided he wanted to make a Saw movie and kind of inject some of his comedy into it, but still make it Saw. And that's what he did. And the results, well, we'll get into it in the conversation. Joining me on this episode is Carlo from the Thief's Monthly Movie Loot podcast, and we have a great conversation with some really good puzzle pieces, I think. So we will be getting into that in a minute. But before we do, I want to remind you, as always, to make sure you're subscribed to Piecing It Together wherever you listen to podcasts. We got a lot of episodes on the way, so make sure to click that subscribe button. And if you like what we do here on the show, make sure to rate and review us. You could do that over on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And you could also follow us on social media at Piecing Pod. And don't forget about our Facebook group, Popcorn and Puzzle Pieces, where we continue the conversation about all the movies we talk about here on the show. And last but not least, before we get into this conversation, I do want to remind you we have a Patreon. You might even be hearing this on the Patreon right now if you're one of our subscribers. But over on our Produced by David Rosen Patreon, I combine content from this podcast as well as some of the other podcasts I'm involved with and my music career. So lots of great content over there. We're pushing a whole lot of extra new content on there in the next couple of weeks here. So definitely check that out. It's the Produced by David Rosen Patreon, patreon.com/bydavidrosen. So let's get into today's episode about Spiral. All right, so we're going to get into Spiral from the Book of Saw. And joining me to help me with it is Carlo from the Thief's Monthly Movie Loot podcast. Carlo, how's it going?
Everything cool. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, before we get into Spiral, it's your first time on the show. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about you and what you do?
Well, I'm from Puerto Rico. My name is Carlo, like you said. And I always say I'm a cinephile by heart and a IT technician by necessity because I work IT. Well, really, my real passion is movies. That's why I have my own podcast, Thief's Monthly Movie, like you said, where I talk about the films I watch every month, where I talk with guests. I have guests and talk about different topics, different movie topics, and that's it.
Cool, yeah. And, you know, obviously you talk about like a wide range of movie-related topics and stuff like that. Are horror movies a big passion of yours?
Yes, I usually, my favorite genre, if I watch everything, but my favorite genre tends to be thrillers, but then maybe horror, sci-fi. That's more or less my jam.
Okay, good. Yeah, because not necessarily mine. So going into a movie like Spiral, I really liked the first Saw. I mean, kind of who didn't? I feel like everybody liked the first Saw movie. Second movie, it just did nothing for me. Third movie, I think I might have even walked out of, and then I don't think I've watched any of the other ones since then. So it's an interesting thing to like dive back in like 6 movies later or something into this series.
Well, if we're gonna be honest, I'm exactly just like you. Like I said, I'm more into horror, I think. But with the Saw franchise, I'm just like you. I love the first one. I remember I saw it in theaters, and with my best friend. And I remember that when the twist in the end came, even if that twist really I don't think holds up that well when you examine it, but it really blew our minds, and we were like, what? but the second one, just like you, it really did nothing for me. The third one, I saw it and I just thought it was pretty bad, and I didn't see any of the other ones.
You checked out at the same time, huh?
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I approached this one, I was intrigued by Chris Rock's involvement.
Sure.
I think it's what I heard, that he was the one that drove the driving force behind this, and I really was intrigued because I don't know if you've seen I'm intrigued by this direction that he's taking. I don't know if you've
Mhm.
seen Fargo, the series.
Not yet. I'm really looking forward to watching it. I love that show, and yeah, I mean, I love Chris
Yeah.
Rock, so I definitely want to watch it.
The most recent season, he's the lead, and he does a pretty good job. I mean, he's not great, but he does a pretty good job at a serious character.
Mhm.
So that's kind of the reason that I thought, maybe this might work.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I exactly the same for me. The Chris Rock angle definitely is what drew me in. I mean, I've always been a big fan of Chris Rock for the longest time. As a matter of fact, I have a Pootie Tang license plate. My license plate is Klipa from the movie Pootie Tang. But yeah, so Chris Rock, big fan, and it's interesting to see him try this stuff. And of course, this movie was his idea. I mean, he didn't like write it or direct it or anything like that, but it comes from his idea of a
Yeah.
project for himself. And I think that'll come up more in our puzzle pieces as we get along. But why don't we just jump right in now and start talking about some puzzle pieces? What do you have for your first one?
Okay. I'm gonna start with the obvious one before you snatch it. And the first puzzle piece I have is 7.
Sure. Yeah.
Uh, this is one that it's pretty much compared on almost every article you read about the film. You have a serial killer with a moralistic agenda, and it's
Hmm.
pursued by two cops, reluctant partners. You have a veteran that happens to be an African American, and you have a rookie or a younger one that seems to be more idealistic.
Hmm.
Also, I don't know who needs to hear this, but Chris Rock is currently about as old as Morgan Freeman was when 7 came out. So there you go.
That's crazy. Yeah.
But yeah, but you see him and you think, oh, he was very old, but Chris Rock is 56, I think, and Morgan Freeman was 58 or something
Chris
when
Rock does not age. He looks
no,
exactly the same.
yeah, it's incredible. But anyway, this connection I think goes even back to the original Saw, which also featured the same template and also had two cops. But the original didn't rely that much in the cop angle, but rather on the Cary Elwes and Lee Whannell trapped in the bedroom angle.
Hmm.
In this one, I think it's more evident, and I think director Bousman has said as much. In 7, you had a serial killer forcing people to atone for their sins, which is kind of
Right.
what Jigsaw did. But anyway, one of the arguments between Mills and Somerset in 7 is that John Doe is punishing instead of making them repent. Here, the serial killer is following the same MO, but you can argue that
Hmm.
he's actually punishing those that he holds responsible for killing his father. We're you're gonna put the spoiler warning, right?
Oh yes, absolutely. Spoil away.
Okay. There's even the delivery of a box at one point in Spiral.
Hmm.
Even though Boseman doesn't handle the tension as well as obviously as in 7, but there is
Sure.
that. And in both films, it all boils down to a climatic confrontation in which a loved one from one of the detectives is in danger and ultimately killed, allowing the killer to succeed one way or another.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. No happy endings here.
Yeah.
And yeah, definitely the tension around what's in the box is a major part of Spiral as it was in 7. And I think I even read that part of Chris Rock's initial pitch was 7 meets 48 hours. Because, like the Eddie Murphy classic, he was trying to kind
Yeah.
of bring his comedy into this very heavy, very dark thriller type of movie, which is pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
you can definitely see that, and I'm gonna probably mention that on one of my other puzzle pieces, but yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Awesome. Well, I'll go right along with that. And, talking about Chris Rock and taking this rookie recruit along with him and police business, I'm going to go with Training Day for another puzzle piece because, aside from the main through story of, oh, this is a Saw movie and there's a killer putting people in these crazy traps and lots of gore and all that kind of stuff. The meat of this movie is really Chris Rock riding around with Max Minghella, and really kind of like razzing him and trying to make his job tough and like really show him the ropes and make it difficult for him. And we don't, find out until later on that, maybe he should have been a little nicer to this guy, because of where things end up going. But yeah, I mean, I think that is kind of what makes this movie a little bit more enjoyable. And I should say, this movie is absolutely being trashed as far as critics are concerned. I'm not quite sure. I don't think we talked ahead of time what you ended up thinking of the movie, if you like it or not. I didn't hate it. I feel like even though this movie is getting trashed so badly by critics, I actually kind of enjoyed it a little bit.
I'm probably closer to you than trashing it. I didn't hate it, but it's definitely not that good. I will say some of the performances are shaky. Everybody's like too loud in the police precinct. Like everybody feels the need to scream.
Sure. Yeah.
Scream. But the twist, you can see it from a mile.
Yes.
The flashbacks are pretty, I don't know, I didn't like them that much. The traps I felt were uninspired, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I think that it's too bland to be a Saw, to see it as a Saw sequel. And it's not that thrilling to see it as a crime thriller or as a police thriller. So it kind of sits in that middle ground where, there's some talent involved and there's some good stuff here and there. And I kind of like Chris Rock in it. I think he almost pulls it out. But other than that, I wasn't really that big of a fan.
Yeah, if it wasn't for Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson being Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson, this movie would be a total wash. But because of them and their personalities, I think you could do much worse with 90 minutes of your time, And that's another thing. This movie doesn't overstay its welcome like a lot of movies lately.
Even if I think it could have had like maybe 5 minutes more, I think the ending was too abrupt.
It is very abrupt. Yeah.
Just kind of ended, and that's it.
Yeah,
but that's it.
Well, why don't we move on to your next puzzle piece? What do you got?
Okay, from an obvious one, I'm going to switch to one that might seem like a stretch, so bear with me. But I do think it serves as some sort of a faraway inspiration, and I think there's bits and pieces of it are definitely in Spiral's DNA, and it's Pulp Fiction.
Okay.
The connections I saw, they go from fairly obvious, like the casting of Samuel L. Jackson, the fact that the main character is called Ezekiel, Zeke,
Sure.
Jules Winfield's favorite Bible verse, to the pairing of two characters in Ezekiel and Schenk. Obviously, in this case, they are cops as opposed to hitmen, but I think the film makes kind of the point that they behave like hitmen, killing innocent people, storming into apartments. In a more subtle Easter egg-like way, there are a couple of shots that I felt were homages to Tarantino's film. In the scene where Banks and his partners are raiding an apartment, there's a shot from inside the trunk as they pull out their shotguns, kind of like in Pulp Fiction or pretty much every Tarantino film. There's also a scene when Banks and Schenk, they go to the subway where the first character was killed, where Bousman pulled a neat continuous shot as they go inside and down into the station. And Banks and Schenk have sort of playful banter at that point, which kind of gave me vibes of Jules and Vincent walking through the apartment hallways looking for bread. And finally, there's an Easter egg from Bousman. I don't know if you noticed, but right after the wax trap, the one with the captain, when Banks walks out of that basement, there's a door that reads Jules and Vincent, or Vincent and Jules, something like that.
Oh,
which
wow.
I read that, which I read that Bousman did obviously as a result of Samuel L. Jackson's casting.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah, it's funny you're naming all these little Easter eggs that are in there, but I did not even catch like half of those. So those are some really interesting ones, and I think this is a movie that I think it's very much inspired by these kinds of movies, like these kinds of crime thrillers, and of course, Tarantino is such a huge influence on everything that's come since him. I mean, obviously, him
Yeah.
himself is influenced by so many crime things that came before him, but he has such a huge shadow over everything that's come since, and so I think that makes a lot of sense. And then I'll just throw in there, not a fully formed puzzle piece or anything, but just talking about like Easter eggs and references to Tarantino. I also thought of Samuel L. Jackson at the end of The Hateful Eight when he's like bleeding out and he's like, pleading with what's his name to shoot this motherfucker, and like
Yeah.
it just reminded me of the same kind of Samuel L. Jackson energy that we get there.
Yeah. Yeah. You can definitely see that.
Yeah. So, cool. Yeah. I'm going to go to another puzzle piece. And I don't know how much the previous Saw movies, like I said, I haven't seen like the last few of them. I only saw those first few. I don't know how much the traps are like this, but definitely in Spiral, it feels this way. I thought of Mortal Kombat fatalities, specifically in the game, not so much these movies, the new movie or the old classic movies, but in the video games, the way that they're not part of the actual narrative. The actual narrative in those games would be fighting each other, but then you push a bunch of buttons and you watch this fatality unfold. That's not actually part of the narrative. It's almost like a cut scene. And in this movie, every single death trap thing, it's not happening in real time. It's all flashbacks to things that already happened. And so like they're completely cut out of the narrative or any sense of timing of these characters and what they're going through. And so it just feels like that, where it's just like, okay, now we're going to show you a person getting killed graphically for like 2 minutes, and then we'll get back to the actual story. And so that's how the traps feel in this movie. Maybe that's how they are in a lot of the other Saw movies, I'm not sure, but Mortal Kombat fatalities.
That's a good one. That's definitely a good one. I think it could have definitely benefited from seeing someone pull the spine out of someone, but well,
Oh,
at least we had a nerve. What was it? A spiral nerve or something severed. But well,
they're getting really out there. I joked on Twitter that hopefully in the next one someone will build a large hadron collider and just completely rip time fabric out of someone's face. I don't know,
but since we're talking about that, before I go into my next puzzle piece, one of the things I didn't like about the direction that the Saw films went is the fact that the traps became like the focal point of the film. And if you look at the first one, which is the only one I liked, it was more psychological. And the traps were there. The traps were there, but they were like flashbacks, quick flashbacks, and you saw this guy trapped in a room with razors, this girl with the helmet, and the focus was this dynamic between Carrie Elwes and Lee Wanell, and what they were going to do with each other, and if they were going to betray each other or not. But then the traps kind of became the focal point, and we're coming up with traps and trying to build a weak narrative around them, and that was a turn off eventually for me.
Yeah, no, I agree. That is, and it's funny. Like I haven't seen the original Saw since like opening weekend when it came out in the theater. I remember liking it a lot, but I also like barely remember the traps. Like I remember the twist of it all, and I remember the mystery and like the the excitement of how are they going to get out of this situation. The traps were like second nature, so it is crazy. That's what this whole series became about.
Yeah.
So what do you got next?
So my next puzzle piece might go back a bit to what you mentioned about 48 hours. One could argue that Spiral draws inspiration from countless body cop films from the 80s and the 90s. But the one I think had the biggest connections were Lethal Weapon 1 and 2.
Sure.
Obviously, you have, again, two cops, reluctant partners, a veteran that happens to be an African-American, reluctantly paired with a younger one. But beyond that, the second one, Lethal Weapon 2, you have the bad guys targeting a group of cops. Murtaugh, Riggs, and all their partners with, guess what? A series of booby traps, which most people remember more from Murtaugh's rig toilet.
Sure. Yeah.
Which is kind of what we get in Spiral with the killer targeting Banks and his partners with a series of traps. I also think Spiral would have definitely benefited from a toilet trap, but, well.
Yeah, that would have been good. That would fit too really well.
Yeah.
I can picture Samuel L. Jackson just screaming about it. It'd be like, but yeah, no, great pieces. And let's also not forget, Lethal Weapon 4, Chris Rock was in that one.
Oh,
So,
yeah.
it's probably sticking in his head.
Yeah, flew past me. Yeah, but you're right.
But yeah, those movies, fantastic. I haven't watched either of those in a long time, but they were so great at the time. And yeah, the way that they mix like all of that, the traps and the cop stuff and comedy and all of it, they're just really fun movies and they're great.
Yeah.
I'm gonna move to another piece, and this one's actually not a movie or a form of entertainment or anything like that. It's kind of a curveball of a puzzle piece, but I think a inspiration for where this particular story goes is a lot of the current political climate right now, ever since the George Floyd murder, and I would say like the whole ACAB thing, the whole all cops are bastards, which I think is definitely a point of view that this film has, where the cops, every single one of them is at best problematic and
Yeah.
covering up bad cop behavior, and at worst are just straight up freaking killers, and the worst aspects of what we are associating police with right now in the real world. And so I think that is definitely on the mind of the filmmakers while writing this movie and creating a situation where some of the worst of that world are kind of getting their comeuppance in Saw fashion.
But that puzzle piece goes perfectly with my fourth one,
Okay.
because the other one, this is another one that at first it seemed like a stretch to me, but I did get some vibes from it, and from what you mentioned on that puzzle piece, it definitely there's something of it there, and it's L.A. Confidential.
Sure.
LA Confidential features again a trio of reluctant partners that find themselves in the midst of a conspiracy of police corruption, with instances of police brutality where some figures of authority aren't who they seem to be.
Hmm.
And here in Spiral, you obviously have a group of corrupt, like you said, corrupt and murderous cops, which include the figures of authority in the former captain, which is played by Samuel Jackson, as well as the current captain, which is played by Marisol Nichols.
Hmm.
And I've read that, although to go to what you were mentioning, although the film and script were written before the recent events of George Floyd, Breonna Banks, and Amari, and whatever,
Hmm.
the list is
The
endless.
list goes on and
Yeah,
on. Yeah.
that Bousman apparently wanted to shed a light on the issue of police brutality even before this happened. So there's that as well.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, it's certainly a thing that stretches back in this country's
Yeah.
history a long, long time. So there's plenty of examples of it, and it would have been around, like you said, all the way back, L.A. Confidential, further back from there. But yeah, definitely, it's such a big thing in the ether right now as movies are being made. I'm sure we'll see more movies that kind of delve into that, and maybe in slightly more subtle ways, not
Yes.
not Saw
Definitely.
spiral ways. But okay, I'll go with my final piece here, which I'm gonna actually combine a couple of movies that I feel ended in somewhat similar ways here. Like you kind of touched on the abruptness of the ending earlier, and one of them actually talking about L.A. Confidential, another Kevin Spacey movie, not exactly having the best moment these last few years, but The Usual Suspects, and then also I'll combine with that Ex Machina, a movie that I love so much, but both movies that end with like that big reveal and the main characters basically losing and left kind of like yelling in disbelief and shock that they were just bested and the bad guys getting away. And major spoiler alerts for Spiral, but we already said that. But yeah, I mean, this movie literally just ends on the cliffhanger of the bad guy getting away, and those were like the first two examples of that kind of came to mind.
Yeah, I was struggling to come up with more puzzle pieces, but the names escaped me. But I was thinking, what what were these films where um, a kid sees one of his parents killed, and then he comes back to seek revenge,
Sure.
or what are these films where the partner ends up being the traitor or the bad guy? And I know there are
Yeah.
endless examples, but I just couldn't come up. I kept my mind kept going blank. But yeah, those are two great examples. Yeah, and it goes back to, for example, Seven as well.
Sure.
Another example of the bad guy winning.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very bleak movie, and a tradition that's very bleak. A lot of these kinds of movies, but I think that kind of lends itself to kind of the dark kind of story that I think this kind of film is trying to tell and sell. But I'll go ahead and do the finished puzzle here. Read down the list of things we talked about, and then we'll get into some closing thoughts about
Yeah.
Spiral. We talked about, well, of course, we included some of the other Saw movies in the mix there, but then also we talked about Seven, Training Day, Pulp Fiction, Mortal Kombat, Lethal Weapon, ACAB, LA Confidential, and The Usual Suspects, and Ex Machina. So, are there any other closing thoughts you have, or things that we kind of didn't get to while going through puzzle pieces here?
Well, I don't know what's in plan for this spin-off. I think I didn't check, but I think it's not doing that well in the box office.
Not
Uh,
particularly, yeah.
no, but because the critics, like you say, have trashed it. But I will be intrigued to see maybe a different director or maybe a different writer,
Hmm.
kind of like take the story further into this thriller, cop thriller field. But like we're saying, I don't know. I doubt it's gonna happen now.
Right. Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to imagine that they would continue it with it not doing so well, and especially the. I mean, the critical response doesn't always matter, but I mean, definitely box office matters, and it's hard to imagine. But I do think, like we started the conversation talking about Chris Rock and how much we like him, and I think that there's definitely places to go with the character. I think the character could be in a better version of this if they were to continue it. There's also the kind of elephant in the room of the fact that Tobin Bell does not return in this
Yeah,
and could potentially, be filtered back in. And I don't know if that would maybe do something for fans of the series. Obviously wouldn't do much for me necessarily, but I don't know. I don't know if I would be interested in seeing more of this. But like I said, it just the whole movie exists. I joked on my letterbox that it's not a so bad it's good movie. It's just a good bad movie. And like a movie that like you can watch and it's not great, but at the same time you're kind of entertained by the end of the 90 minutes.
yeah. You don't hate it, and you don't scream at it, but you kind of forget about it shortly afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, you mentioned earlier the melted wax death trap, and I had forgotten that one completely. I remember some of the other ones, but yeah, just right out of my head, just gone. But and that was pretty creepy, but it still didn't make a
Yeah,
lasting impression.
I'm still figuring out could someone survive if he or she severs his spinal cord? I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. Actually, that was a moment in the movie. Yeah, because he starts like pushing down her, trying to give her CPR. It's like there's a big
Yeah.
knife in the back of her neck now. Like, yeah, I don't think it's gonna work. But I don't know. I think that about does it for this movie. I think we gave this movie a lot of benefit of the doubt in going through these puzzle pieces, and I think we kind of covered it as best as this movie kind of deserves to be covered. But I think that does it. Is there a movie you watched recently that you'd like to recommend to our listeners, Carlo?
Well, there are two films that I would like to mention because they're the last ones I saw between Spiral, and they're not very well known. I actually didn't know about them until I just saw them last week. The first
Hmm.
one is called Le Jour se lève. It's a 1939 French film
Okay.
directed by Marcel Carnet. And somebody recommended it to me. I hadn't even heard about it, but it's about this worker that meets this woman and they start a relationship. but he realizes that she's more interested in another guy, a kind of sleazy entertainer or magician.
Hmm.
And it's the dynamic that develops after that. It's very, it was great, really. I really, really loved it. It goes back and forth with flashbacks and where the character is right now and where he was and how he met this woman. And it felt ahead of its time. It's the kind of film that when I saw it, I thought, this feels as if it was made 20, 30, 40 years later. It's
Right,
from
right.
1939. It has a noirish vibe to it,
Hmm.
but it was pretty good. The
Cool.
other one was not very good. It wasn't bad, but it surprised me. It's a 1974 slasher film called Devil Times Five.
Okay.
um, and it's about a group of kids, 5 kids. That's why it's called Devil Times Five, that escape from an asylum or something because they have psychological problems, and they are killers. And they end up finding their way to a cabin of a rich man where he's with some family and co-workers, and the kids basically start killing them all. So it was not great, but it was interesting. It was edgy, and it was a bit of a bold film.
All right. Yeah, I've never heard of it, but I just looked up the artwork and I love the artwork for it. It's like this kind of like silhouette that's like all scratchy drawn.
Yeah,
It looks really cool.
yeah. It was pretty good. It surprised. I mean, going back to what I said, it wasn't great, but it
Right.
was it was uh, surprising.
Okay.
Let's call it that way.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, great recommendations there. And Carlo, why don't you tell people again where they could find you and your podcast?
Well, they can follow me on Twitter at ThiefCGT, ThiefCGT. They can also follow the podcast Twitter at TMML2021. The podcast is available on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, and Podchaser. You can look it for Thief's Monthly Movie Loot, and you can find me there, and you can listen to my episodes, leave a review, share the link, and let me know what you think.
Awesome. And I'm looking forward to joining you on an episode real soon. I got a couple ideas I'm going to run by you soon.
Yeah,
So
we can bounce around ideas and see where when we can get together.
perfect. Sounds good. Well, Carlo, thank you so much for doing the show.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, hey! Are you that weird one in your friends group that loves to watch true crime documentaries? Have you ever wanted to learn more about the lesser known crimes? And are you fascinated with ghost stories? I'm Hannah, the creator, editor, and host of Murder Bucket, a podcast that talks about, get this, murders, paranormal activity, abductions, kidnappings, and weird stuff. Join me every Tuesday wherever you listen to podcasts to get the inside scoop on some of the most interesting topics in the true crime world. I am also very active on social media. You can find me on Instagram at MurdBucket, Facebook at BucketMurd, and Twitter at The Murder Bucket.
All right, so I hope you enjoyed that conversation about Spiral. Thanks to Carlo for joining me on that episode, and definitely check out his podcast. I will be on there soon enough. We're planning an episode to record sometime soon. I was really busy in the month of May and didn't do that many guest appearances, but June is already kind of filling up. But if anybody out there wants David Rosen from the Piecing It Together podcast on their podcast, get in touch with me. And if you want to join me for an episode of Piecing It Together, get in touch with me too. Lots of movies coming up that we're going to want to cover here on the show. So thank you as always to everybody who's listening. Make sure you are subscribed to Piecing It Together wherever it is you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to follow us on social media at Piecing Pod on all the major social media apps. And we also have our Facebook group, Popcorn and Puzzle Pieces, where we continue the conversation about all the movies we talk about here on the show. And I told you about the Patreon at the top of the show. Check that out. Produced by David Rosen. Lots of great content. A bunch more coming soon on there. and you might be listening to this on there right now. And if you are, I thank you very much for being a subscriber. So I am, at the time of this recording, about to finish up this film that I've been working so hard on the past month. So I am going to close out the show with a piece of music that digs into my soundtrack album that I put out last year, Beater, the original motion picture soundtrack, which combines music from the feature film Beater that I scored and a bunch of short films with the same director, Chris Johnson. And this one is actually the first film we worked on together, called The Usher. It's a kind of like a thriller, maybe psychological thriller, but with a little bit of a horror aspect to it. But yeah, this is included on the Beater soundtrack album as one of the short films that we worked on, and nice and dark and thrillery, and I think a good fit for an episode on Spiral, on a Saw movie. So enjoy this track. It's called The Usher, and it actually played over the end credits of the film, and you can check that film out on the Free Your Mind Films YouTube channel. I'll put a link in the show notes, and you can check the album out on iTunes or on Spotify or any of the digital music services. So check that out, check both of those things out, and we'll be back with more Piecing It Together coming up real soon.
An All Points West production, produced by David Rosen in Las Vegas.